2,000 years before the Arab conquest, the Ottoman rule, and French colonization, North Africa had already witnessed its first unification under a single powerful leader. His name was Massinissa, a visionary Berber king who transformed a patchwork of warring tribes into the Kingdom of Numidia. Through strategic alliances, political cunning, and military brilliance, he forged a nation that stretched from the sands of the Sahara to the shores of the Mediterranean. Yet the very choices that secured his triumph planted the seeds of future vulnerability. In seeking unity and power, Massinissa opened the doors to Rome's influence, binding Numidia's destiny to an empire far greater and far more enduring than its own. This is the story of Algeria's first independence, and how its rise became the beginning of 2,000 years of struggle against foreign domination. Algeria's story reaches back to a time when the Sahara was not a barren desert, but a thriving grassland. Thousands of years ago, wide rivers threaded through valleys, and shallow lakes drew herds of antelope, giraffes, and elephants across the plains. The land supported a web of life that would later disappear under sand. In this green Sahara, early humans found both sanctuary and challenge. Fossils and stone fragments suggest that Homo erectus roamed northwestern Africa around 1.5 million years ago, using simple hand axes to butcher animals and shape wood. Much later, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, settled this same landscape, leaving behind scattered camps, tools, and markings that still trace their migrations. Archaeological findings reveal an evolving relationship between people and the shifting environment. Flint tools became smaller and more specialized, indicating refined techniques and diverse diets. Along dried stream beds and ancient lake shores, hearths and refuse layers mark the presence of organized groups moving seasonally to hunt gazelle, gather fruit, and fish in shallow waters. The rhythm of these movements created a kind of early pattern of settlement that foreshadowed the oases to come. In their discarded tools and animal bones, researchers see the earliest outlines of what would one day become a continuous human presence in North Africa. By the end of the Ice Age, a distinctive culture flourished in what is now eastern Algeria, the Caspian. Emerging around 10,000 BCE, it lasted for several thousand years and left behind thick deposits of shells, tools, and ornaments that define its archaeological structure. These people shaped narrow-backed blades from flint, decorated ostrich eggshells, and buried their dead with ochre, beads, and antler fragments. Their sites, especially near Gafsa and Tebessa, suggest settled communities relying on hunting, foraging, and seasonal movement rather than permanent agriculture. The evidence points to long-term adaptation to a region that was gradually drying as the once green Sahara began turning into steppe and then into the desert we know today. As the climate hardened, later Neolithic groups responded with innovation rather than flight. They began domesticating animals, first cattle, then sheep and goats, and managing small plots around natural wells. Early rock engravings in central Algeria display herds watched over by human figures, suggesting the early roots of pastoral life. This adaptation introduced the idea of the oasis as a social and economic hub, connecting people through trade and shared resources. The transition also sparked changes in social organization. Megalithic tombs, known as bazinas, appear across the high plateaus and coastal hills. Built from massive stones and arranged in circular patterns, they signal emerging hierarchies and ancestor veneration, marking a key step toward ritual society. One of the most revealing sources of this era lies in the remote Tassili Najir Mountains, where thousands of panels of rock art preserve scenes of daily life. Hunters carry bows, dancers form circles, cattle graze under patterned skies, and swimmers move through what must have been real pools of water. Some figures take on unusual shapes, elongated bodies crowned by mushroom-like heads, sometimes with lines radiating outward. Scholars have debated their meaning for decades, but many people believe they represent trance experiences or ritual use of psychoactive plants. If that interpretation holds true, these images may be the world's earliest record of hallucinogenic or ecstatic ceremony. From these stones emerges a society both pragmatic and spiritual, fully aware of the changing earth beneath them. The echoes of their adaptation and belief would shape the cultural memory that survived long after the savannas vanished under sand. As the prehistoric era gave way to more complex societies, the people of North Africa began to organize themselves into language and identity groups recognizable as Berber. By the first millennium BCE, their communities had moved far beyond the seasonal foraging and small-scale herding of earlier times. Distinct regions were now developing their own local forms of leadership, each controlling portions of the trade routes that connected the inland mountains, the fertile coastal plains, and the deep Saharan interior. These routes moved salt northward from desert oases, carried metal ore and ivory toward the coast, and brought Mediterranean goods, wine, textiles, and tools into the hands of Berber chiefs who watched over both markets and caravans. Control of these corridors defined power. The leader who could guarantee safe passage, deliver tribute, and settle disputes among merchants became more than just a clan elder. He became the ruler of a small state. Along the northern coast, Phoenician traders from the Levant began to appear around the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. They arrived first as seafarers in search of metals and safe harbors, founding small ports at Hippo Regius, Tipasa, and other sites along what is now the Algerian shoreline. These outposts served as way stations for ships sailing between the great cities of Carthage and Gadir, while also becoming meeting points between Berber traders and the wider Mediterranean world. Exchanges went far beyond commerce. New technologies, artistic styles, and religious ideas began filtering inland. Carthaginian merchants favored alliances with local Berber lords, offering coinage, tools, and luxury goods in exchange for access to inland markets. Over time, several of these tribal confederations evolved into recognizable kingdoms, some controlling considerable stretches of territory from the coastal plains to the edge of the desert. Among the developments that reshaped this age was the mastery of iron. Around the first millennium BCE, iron smelting spread through the Maghreb, replacing softer bronze and revolutionizing warfare. Iron-tipped spears, sharper blades, and improved agricultural tools gave their holders both tactical and economic advantage. Horse domestication also transformed mobility. Mounted warriors could now move swiftly across terrain that had once separated valleys and tribes. This speed and reach created new forms of political cohesion. A chief who could command a cavalry had influence far beyond his ancestral lands. Raiding, tribute collection, and intertribal diplomacy became a part of a broader system of politics that held multiple groups together through negotiation and personal authority. Leadership in these early Berber states rarely followed strict hereditary succession. Instead, power rested on charisma, skill in battle, and the ability to hold alliances through persuasion or rewards. Oral tradition, rather than written law, preserved the legitimacy of rulers. Many smaller clans owed loose loyalty to greater confederations, creating a political landscape that was fluid but robust. It allowed adaptability, a trait that would serve Berber societies well against future imperial powers that sought to dominate the region. At the same time, their spiritual world continued to blend old and new influences. Local cults dedicated to earth, water, or sky intertwined with imported Phoenician deities such as Baal Haman and Tanit, showing a religion shaped by exchange rather than conquest. Proto-urban centers began to rise during this period. Small fortified towns appeared on elevated ground, sometimes encircled by simple stone walls to protect storage pits and workshops. Archaeologists identify them as the first experiments in urban life in Algeria, precursors to later cities like Sirte and Tlemcen. Within these enclosures, craftspeople produced pottery, metal ornaments, and iron tools that circulated along the same trade routes linking interior and coast. The economic specialization encouraged further settlement, and with it, more stable political institutions. Berber cavalry, meanwhile, earned such a reputation for skill and endurance that foreign powers recruited them as mercenaries long before Rome existed as an empire. Units from North Africa fought in Sicily, Spain, and southern Italy, carrying with them both the tactics and the identity of their rugged homeland. In every sense, the Berber kingdoms were already tied to the wider world, autonomous yet interconnected, local yet distinctly Mediterranean. By the 4th century BCE, the web of Berber kingdoms that had dominated North Africa began to consolidate under stronger rulers who commanded both cavalry and territory. From this process emerged Numidia, a loose confederation that stretched across modern northern Algeria and parts of Tunisia. Its people shared linguistic and cultural ties, but political unity came only after a generation of warfare among competing chieftains. At first, the lands were divided between two principal regions, the eastern domain of the Masli and the western realm of the Masesli. Both cultivated alliances with outside powers, particularly the Carthaginians, who relied on North Africa's cavalry for their campaigns across the Mediterranean. But the balance of power between these Numidian states constantly shifted. But their leaders learned early that diplomacy with distant empires could be as decisive as battles fought on home soil. When the Punic Wars erupted between Carthage and Rome in the 3rd century BCE, that lesson became critical. The Masli king, Gaia, allied with Carthage, while his rival, Syphax of the Masesli, looked first to neutrality and later to Rome for support. The unstable triangle of alliances created both opportunity and danger. In this environment, Gaia's young heir, Massinissa, emerged as a commander of unusual skill. As a prince serving Carthage, he led Numidian cavalry into campaigns across Iberia, gaining experience in logistics, fast movement, and battlefield discipline. Yet as Carthage began to falter under Roman pressure, he recalculated. Recognizing that the future of Numidia depended on backing the eventual victor, he shifted alliance to Rome shortly before its final offensive. With Roman aid, Massinissa reclaimed his ancestral lands and defeated Syphax in 203 BCE. With the years that followed, he transformed a collection of tribal groups into a single monarchy recognized by both allies and adversaries. Rome viewed Numidia as a useful partner against Carthage, granting Massinissa nominal independence in exchange for loyalty and grain supplies. Once in power, he pursued stabilization through settlement. Encouraged by Roman advisors, he introduced large-scale agriculture, promoting olive groves and cereal fields that turned parts of Algeria into a productive center feeding the Mediterranean basin. Archaeological traces of terraces, irrigation works, and food storage sites reflect this early agrarian policy. Massinissa's court displayed a distinctive blend of cultures. Berber nobility preserved ancestral customs and oral laws, while Punic administrators provided systems of record-keeping and trade management. Hellenistic influences appeared through art, architecture, and coin design, linking Numidia to the wider world of Mediterranean monarchies. The capital at Sirte emerged as a hub of administration and military organization. Its workshops produced weapons, ceramics, and coins stamped with Numidian symbols. The kingdom stood out as one of the very few African states of this era recognized by Rome as an allied power rather than a dependency, and that recognition reflected both diplomacy and utility. The stability Massinissa achieved, however, depended heavily on his personal authority. After his death in 148 BCE, succession disputes among his sons fractured the unity he had created. Rome exploited the rivalries, intervening as arbiter and then as master. Generations later, under the ambitious Prince Jugurtha, Numidia attempted one final assertion of independence. His war against the Romans in the late 2nd century BCE, fought through ambush and attrition, revealed both the persistence of Numidian resistance and the reach of Roman manipulation. Defeat led to annexation, and by 46 BCE, Numidia was absorbed as part of Rome's North African frontier. Yet Massinissa's military legacy endured. His light cavalry, fast, disciplined, and elusive, impressed Roman generals so deeply that they copied its tactics. Julius Caesar himself later praised their ghost-like speed across the desert plains, testimony to a warrior tradition that survived long after the kingdom's fall. When Numidia finally fell under Roman control in the 1st century BCE, northern Algeria entered 4 centuries of imperial rule that bound it to the economic core of the Mediterranean world. The fertile plains between the Tel Atlas and the coast became some of the most productive farmlands of the Western Empire. Roman administrators organized the territory into provinces, built networks of taxation, and turned Algeria into a major supplier of grain, olive oil, and wine. Vast estates, known as villae, covered the countryside, where enslaved laborers and local tenants worked to fill shiploads bound for Roman ports. The label Granary of the West was as much a logistical description as it was a compliment. These harvests sustained legions and cities across the empire. New settlements appeared alongside older Berber and Punic towns. Veteran soldiers, rewarded with land grants, founded colonies that mirrored the layout of Italian municipalities. Timgad, Kuikul, known today as Jamila, and Tipasa exemplified this wave of urban planning. Straight streets intersected at right angles, lined with colonnades, markets, and thermal baths. The remains of forums, triumphal arches, and theaters reveal how thoroughly Roman municipal life penetrated inland Africa. Unlike many distant frontiers, Algeria's settlements developed into self-sustaining urban centers rather than mere garrisons. Latin inscriptions show local elites adopting Roman names and administrative titles, yet linguistic traces in rural regions confirm that Berber dialects continued to thrive outside city walls. A dense web of infrastructure tied these cities together. Roman engineers carved roads through mountain passes and over plateaus to connect the coast to interior strongholds such as Lambaesis, home to the 3rd Augustan Legion. Aqueducts brought water across long stretches of arid land, supporting both agriculture and public baths. Defensive works, collectively titled the Limes, marked the empire's southern boundary. Forts and watchtowers trailed the desert edge, securing caravan routes and signaling potential incursions. These structures did more than project power. They linked isolated communities to markets and administrators who governed them from hundreds of kilometers away. Over time, local North Africans became integral to the machinery of empire. Berber cavalrymen served in the legions, carrying with them generations of desert warfare experience. Service offered pay, Roman citizenship, and access to upward mobility that extended all the way to the imperial court. By the 2nd century CE, Romans of North African origin occupied high offices throughout the empire. The most famous example was Septimus Severus, born in nearby Leptis Magnus, who rose through the military ranks to become emperor. His career reflected the growing prominence of African provinces in supplying Rome with both wealth and leadership. Roman Algeria also became a major center of religious transformation. By the 3rd century, Christianity had spread through cities like Hippo Regius, Sirta, and Caesarea. Debates over doctrine fractured communities and produced distinctive movements such as Donatism, rooted in arguments about the purity of faith during persecution. These controversies reveal how deeply Christianity had embedded itself into everyday life well before it became the empire's official religion. At the same time, pagan traditions persisted in rural districts, where older Berber deities were quietly worshipped beside classical gods. Even as imperial authority began to fragment in the 4th and 5th centuries, the local population maintained continuity in language and customs. Small farming villages carried on outside the reach of governors and legions, preserving ways of life that stretched back to pre-Roman times. Archaeological surveys show that fields were replanted, pottery styles endured, and oral traditions remained intact long after the Roman administration had begun to fade. Among the ruins of Timgad, one structure captures the lasting imprint of this era, a public library, one of the few known in the ancient Roman world. Its walls once held scrolls read by citizens nearly 2,000 years ago, a reminder that even on the empire's edge, knowledge and urban life flourished side by side. By the early 5th century, Roman authority in North Africa had eroded under internal conflict and economic strain. In 429 CE, a Germanic people known as the Vandals crossed from southern Spain into North Africa, numbering perhaps tens of thousands along with their families and dependents. Their leader, King Gaiseric, saw opportunity in Rome's disarray. Moving along the coast, his forces encountered little organized resistance, and within a decade, they controlled most of the provinces stretching across modern Algeria and Tunisia. The wealth and infrastructure left by centuries of Roman administration became the foundation of a new kingdom with its capital in Carthage. From this seat, Gaiseric ruled an African-based empire that commanded the Western Mediterranean's sea routes and rivaled the great naval powers of its day. The Vandals introduced their own branch of Christianity, known as Arianism. This belief denied certain doctrines upheld by the Catholic Church and immediately set the new rulers apart from the Romanized population that remained in the towns. The result was a deeply divided society. Arian bishops replaced or exiled Catholic clergy, church properties changed hands, and legal privileges were rearranged to favor the newcomers. Yet, for all this disruption, the Vandals largely retained Roman systems of taxation and civic management. Latin continued as the language of administration, and Roman law survived in modified form. Trade networks adapted rather than collapsed, as grain, oil, and pottery continued to move between African ports and southern Europe. Vandal control, however, only reached so far. Beyond the fertile coastal strip, the mountainous interior and high plateaus remained largely independent. Berber tribes in these regions resumed authority over old strongholds, forming small confederations that maintained grazing grounds and caravan routes outside royal control. Some of these groups paid tribute or traded with the coastal rulers, while others raided their settlements. This balance between coast and interior reflected a political geography that had already existed for centuries, maritime centers connected to the wider Mediterranean, and inland peoples sustaining their autonomy through mobility and terrain. Under Gaiseric and his successors, the Vandals built a powerful navy that dominated the sea lanes of the Western Mediterranean. Their fleets raided islands, intercepted merchant ships, and even sacked the city of Rome in 455 CE. The event shocked contemporary observers, not as the triumph of barbarians from Europe, but as the extraordinary success of an African kingdom projecting power across the sea. For several decades, North Africa served as the strategic hub of this Vandal domain. But the state's longevity depended on the strength of its navy and the stability of dynastic succession, both of which began to fail during the 6th century as internal rivalries and external pressures mounted. In 533 CE, the Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Justinian, launched a campaign to reclaim its lost western provinces. General Belisarius landed in North Africa with a well-organized expeditionary force, and, in a series of swift victories, dismantled the Vandal kingdom. North Africa returned to imperial rule, now administered from Constantinople rather than Rome. However, the restored authority proved thin. The Byzantines refortified coastal cities and rebuilt portions of the defensive lines, but they struggled to project influence into inland Algeria, where Berber leaders retained effective independence. Trade persisted through Mediterranean ports, yet the empire faced persistent revolts, heavy taxation, and a shrinking military presence. As the 7th century advanced, this fragile frontier would soon encounter a new religious and political force rising from Arabia, one that would change the region's history yet again. By the middle of the 7th century, North Africa stood at the edge of a new transformation. The Byzantine Empire still held its coastal cities, but decades of instability had weakened its control over the mountains and deserts of Algeria. Into this fragile landscape came the first Arab armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, moving west from Egypt under commanders who sought both expansion and consolidation of the rising Islamic State. Their initial goal was practical: secure routes, collect tribute, and spread a new faith that had already unified vast territories from Arabia to the Nile. The earliest campaigns reached the regions of Tripolitana and Byzacena around 647 CE, confronting Byzantine troops and local Berber forces who guarded upland passes and fortified towns. These early expeditions were limited, marked by raids and negotiated truces rather than immediate conquest. Resistance proved formidable. The dense terrain of the Ourais Mountains and the vast reaches of the Sahara made large-scale occupation difficult. Berber groups fought with the mobility and endurance that had tested so many empires before. Success came gradually over the next several decades as new waves of soldiers and settlers arrived under the Umayyad Caliphate, building stronger bases of operation. One of these outposts, Kairouan, founded around 670 CE in what is now Tunisia, became a turning point. From there, Islamic authority spread westward, serving as both administrative capital and spiritual center. Kairouan's mosques, schools, and markets defined the new pattern of settlement that would anchor Islamic civilization in the Maghreb. The conversion of local populations did not occur overnight. Islam's spread followed regional rhythms shaped by politics, trade, and kinship. Coastal towns, long accustomed to Mediterranean exchange, absorbed the new religion early because of close contact with Arab settlers and administrators. Inland tribes adopted it more gradually, often integrating Islamic practice with older local customs. Scholars later referred to this as Islamization without Arabization, a process where belief changed faster than language or identity. To manage the transition, governors allowed a degree of autonomy to local chiefs as long as they paid taxes and maintained peace. This pragmatic arrangement turned many Berber leaders into partners rather than mere subjects, while the faith's emphasis on equality before God appealed to communities long excluded from imperial hierarchies. Yet differences in interpretation soon appeared. Some Berber groups embraced a sect known as Kharijism, which emerged from disputes within early Islam over leadership and justice. Kharijites rejected dynastic rule and believed that any righteous believer, regardless of birth, could lead the community. For tribes accustomed to shared governance and opposition to central authority, these ideas resonated deeply. In Algeria, Kharijite communities took root in mountain valleys and desert oases, shaping local rebellions across later centuries. The religious landscape of North Africa thus became a mosaic of orthodox and reformist beliefs, all grounded in a common devotion but shaped by regional independence. By the 8th century, Islamic governance had taken firm hold along Algeria's coast and highlands. Arabic administration and coinage introduced new systems for trade and taxation. Caravans carried gold, salt, and slaves through desert routes linking Tlemcen and Tahert with markets far south in the Sahel. Mosques multiplied, many of them rising from the remnants of Roman and Byzantine structures. Builders reused carved blocks and columns. At some sites, Latin inscriptions remain visible beneath arches of early Islamic design. These physical layers captured the continuity of Algerian history, a civilization rewriting itself atop the stones of its predecessors. Islam had given the region a shared faith and written culture, but its expression remained unmistakably North African, rooted in the same autonomy that had resisted every empire before it. In the late 8th century, a quiet but lasting transformation took place in the highlands of central Algeria. Long after the first waves of Arab conquest, when most of North Africa aligned under the Abbasid Caliphate, a different vision of Islamic society emerged among communities who preferred autonomy and religious moderation. These were the Ibadi Muslims, adherents of an early form of Islam that traced its roots to the Kharijite movement, but rejected its more militant factions. Seeking stability away from imperial rivalries, they founded a new political and spiritual center in the upland city of Tahert, modern-day Tahert. From this base, the Rustamid Imamate grew into a state that balanced faith, scholarship, and commerce across the frontier between the Mediterranean and the Sahara. Tahert occupied a strategic position along inland trade routes that linked the northern ports of North Africa with the trans-Saharan corridors leading to West Africa. Caravans moving north carried salt, gold, and ivory. Others brought textiles, pottery, and manuscripts southward. The prosperity this traffic generated turned the Rustamid realm into one of the wealthiest regions of the Maghreb. Unlike the imperial courts of Damascus or Baghdad, the Rustamid government operated as what could be called a theocratic republic. Its leaders, known as imams, were chosen not by birthright, but through consensus among scholars and notable citizens on the basis of personal merit, learning, and moral conduct. This system reflected Ibadi ideals of piety and equality, setting it apart from neighboring dynasties that ruled through hereditary succession. The Rustamids combined religious devotion with an unusually practical approach to governance. Their state functioned as a federation of urban centers and rural tribes bound more by shared belief than by coercion. Taxes supported public projects, scholars received stipends, and trade routes were secured through diplomacy as much as force. Arabic served as the language of administration, yet the population remained ethnically diverse. Berbers, Arabs, Jews, and freed Africans coexisting under a relatively tolerant framework. The imams restrained luxury at court. Accounts suggest they lived with modest means despite presiding over considerable wealth. Tahert itself became a magnet for knowledge. The city's mosques doubled as schools. Its scribes copied religious treatises, and libraries expanded through gifts and commerce. Travelers wrote that scholars there treated books as treasure, sometimes trading rare manuscripts for gold or horses. The circulation of texts connected Tahert to Baghdad, Kairouan, and Cordoba, creating a scholarly network that linked the Maghreb to both the Middle East and Al-Andalus. This learning was not confined to theology. Philosophy, mathematics, and law all found fertile ground in the Imamate's academies, supported by merchant patrons whose fortunes depended on the stability the Rustamids preserved. The Imamate's policy of tolerance further strengthened this position. Christians maintained churches, and Jewish merchants conducted trade openly under the protection of the state. Their participation in finance and trans-Saharan exchange contributed to the cosmopolitan character of Taher's markets. This atmosphere of coexistence gave the region a rare sense of security at a time when political violence defined many parts of the Islamic world. Yet beneath its stability lay pressures that the Rustamid rulers could not ignore. Tensions formed between settled populations and nomadic tribes, and rival Islamic movements, especially those aligned with the emerging Fatimids, challenged Ibadi influence. By the early 10th century, Fatimid forces advanced westward, sending their armies into central Algeria. In 909 CE, Tahert was captured and burned, its libraries scattered, and its scholars forced to flee. The fall of the Rustamid Imamate ended 2 centuries of self-governing Ibadi rule, but its legacy survived in the desert oases of Mazab and across the seas in Oman. There, the traditions first cultivated in Tahert endured, proving that ideas born in an isolated highland city could shape distant corners of the Islamic world. From the deserts and high plateaus of the Maghreb, 2 Berber empires emerged that reshaped the political map of North Africa and left a mark from the Atlantic Ocean to the Western Mediterranean. The first were the Almoravids, who rose in the mid-11th century from a movement of religious reform among the Sanhaja tribes of the Western Sahara. Their founders, originally teachers and traders following routes between Senegal and Morocco, sought to purify local religious practice and strengthen unity among scattered nomadic clans. Guided by a disciplined code of Islamic law, they built fortified rabats, centers of study and defense, along caravan paths. What began as a reform mission soon gathered the structure of a state. By organizing trade and faith together, they created a foundation strong enough to support territorial expansion. The Almoravids' authority grew through control of the trans-Saharan trade routes that carried gold, salt, and slaves. Their capital at Marrakesh connected the inner desert to the Atlantic ports and to markets across North Africa. In Algeria, they consolidated rule over Tlemcen and other key cities, securing both mountain passes and the coastal plains. Wealth from trade financed armies of camel-mounted soldiers, renowned for discipline and mobility across long stretches of desert. This combination of commerce and military organization allowed the Almoravid domain to extend northward into Al-Andalus, where they defended Muslim-ruled Spain against the advancing Christian kingdoms. The empire's unity rested on faith and pragmatism rather than ethnicity, binding Arab scholars, Berber warriors, and Andalusian craftsmen within one political framework. Over time, however, the same centralization that had ensured stability became a source of tension. Regional leaders sought independence, and reformers criticized what they saw as declining moral standards. Out of this criticism arose a second Berber movement, the Almohads. Their founder, Ibn Tumart, a religious scholar from the Atlas Mountains, preached a return to strict monotheism and social justice. After his death, leadership passed to his disciple, Abd al-Mumin, a native of today's Algeria. Abd al-Mumin transformed the movement from a spiritual calling into a professionalized state. Under his command, the Almohads defeated the Almoravids in the mid-12th century and absorbed their territories across North Africa and southern Spain. The new empire established its capital at Marrakesh, but drew its logistical and military power from Algerian territories, especially Tlemcen and Algiers, which served as administrative and garrison centers. The Almohad realm represented both continuity and change. It inherited trade networks and agricultural wealth from its predecessors while pursuing broader cultural aims. Scholars, architects, and artisans flourished under imperial patronage. The empire commissioned grand mosques, such as those in Tinmel and Seville, and emphasized geometric precision and light-focused architecture that would influence later Andalusian design. In Algeria, fortifications and urban planning expanded, linking inland towns to coastal markets. the administration standardized coinage and law, strengthening the region's integration into long-distance commerce stretching toward the Mediterranean and the Sahara alike. Intellectual life also deepened. Thinkers in philosophy and medicine wrote under Almohad support, contributing to debates that reached from the Maghreb to the universities of Andalusia. Despite their rigor, the Almohads promoted a relative cosmopolitanism that welcomes scholars regardless of origin, provided they accepted the empire's unifying creed. These centuries marked a turning point when Berber-led states dominated transcontinental politics and cultural exchange. Among their practical innovations was a network of coastal towers and lighthouses built along the Maghreb's shores. Using fire or polished metal to reflect light, these towers relayed signals across great distances, creating one of the earliest known systems of long-range coastal communication. Such engineering, alongside their governance and scholarship, confirmed the merger of local ingenuity and global ambition that defined Berber civilization at its height. In the early 13th century, as the great Almohad Empire began to fragment, a new Berber dynasty established its seat in Tlemcen. This dynasty, known as the Zayyanids or Abdalwadids, descended from the Zenata tribes who had long inherited the western highlands of modern Algeria. Their rise filled the political gap left by the retreat of larger imperial powers. In 1235, their founder, Yagmurasen ibn Zayyan, declared independence from the Almohads and made Tlemcen his royal capital. From that decision grew a kingdom that endured for more than 3 centuries, holding together lands that connected the Mediterranean coast with the deep Saharan trade lanes. Tlemcen's geography gave it a rare advantage. Set at a crossroads between Morocco and Tunisia, and lying within reach of both sea and desert, it became an essential intermediary between the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. Caravans from the Sahara arrived heavy with salt, gold, dust, and slaves, while ships and merchants from the northern ports brought fabrics, glassware, and European metal goods. The circulation of commodities turned the city into a center of economic gravity for the Western Maghreb. Urban quarters expanded around mosques, gardens, and covered markets, whose craft guilds produced leather goods, textiles, and fine ceramics traded as far as Granada and Cairo. Such prosperity earned the city its later nickname, the Pearl of the Maghreb, a title that spoke more to craft and learning than to imperial power. The Zayyanid rulers understood that their survival depended as much on diplomacy as on armies. To the west stood the Marinid dynasty of Morocco, determined to dominate all of the Maghreb. To the east, the Hafsids ruled from Tunis. Both were larger and more populous, yet both needed Tlemcen's trade routes. The Zayyanid emirs became experts at balancing tribute and alliance, shifting loyalties when necessary to preserve autonomy. Envoys moved constantly between Tlemcen, Fez, and Tunis, carrying not only documents and gifts but also the unspoken understanding that commerce would only flow in times of peace. Even when the Marinids launched repeated sieges, most famously a long blockade in the late 13th century, the city managed to resist through endurance and negotiation. Tlemcen's political flexibility supported a deepening cultural life. Scholars taught law, language, and philosophy in its madrasas, while craftsmen organized themselves into structured guilds that guarded techniques of metalwork, weaving, and inlay. The city's mosques, adorned with elegant Kufic inscriptions and carved stucco, reflected Andalusian artistic traditions carried south by refugees fleeing the Christian reconquest of Spain. Music held special prestige. Andalusian families and court musicians resettled in Tlemcen brought complex melodic forms that blended Arabic and Iberian influences. From these traditions grew schools of composition and performance that became renowned throughout the Western Mediterranean. Judges, poets, and mystics flourished under state patronage, and Sufi orders found in Tlemcen a welcoming environment for spiritual teaching. Over the following centuries, internal disputes among noble families eroded the resilience that had kept the dynasty intact. Leadership changed hands through intrigue and external interference. The growth of maritime trade in the hands of European merchants diverted wealth away from the inland caravan cities, weakening their economies. Meanwhile, Ottoman power expanded westward from Algeria's coastal centers. By the mid-16th century, the Zayyanid kingdom could no longer resist foreign influence. In 1557, Ottoman commanders absorbed Tlemcen into their sphere, ending its independent monarchy but not its cultural prominence. The legacy of the Zayyanid era remained visible in the city's architecture, scholarship, and enduring musical heritage. Tlemcen's instruments and melodies traveled with migrants and envoys across the Mediterranean. Courts from Tunis to Granada sought its performers, ensuring that the sound of Western Algeria became part of a shared artistic language uniting Africa and Europe. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Christian kingdoms of Spain had completed their centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. With the fall of Granada in 1492 and the establishment of a consolidated Spanish crown, attention soon shifted across the Mediterranean. North Africa, fractured by internal rivalries and weakened by economic decline, appeared vulnerable. The Maghreb's fractured Berber and Arab states lacked the unified leadership that had once defined dynasties like the Almohads. For Spain, the conquest of coastal North Africa promised control over vital trade routes, new harbors for its fleets, and a strategic barrier against Ottoman influence. Religious motivation also played a role. The same crusading spirit that had driven the Reconquista justified expansion into Muslim lands just beyond Europe's southern horizon. The first phase of this campaign began in 1505, when Spanish fleets launched a series of assaults on the Algerian coastline. Artillery-armed galleons landed troops at Mers el-Kabir, a harbor west of Oran. Within months, the city fell, providing Spain with its first toehold on African soil. Only 2 years later, Spanish forces captured Oran, turning it into a fortified base guarded by heavy cannon and stone bastions. Their approach combined maritime bombardment with the latest in siege technology, overwhelming the local defenses that had never faced weapons of such range or precision. Algiers followed not long after, though control there fluctuated as local resistance managed occasional counterattacks. These early coastal outposts became the network through which Spain sought to dominate both commerce and seafaring across the western Mediterranean. The sudden arrival of foreign garrisons disrupted the balance of power that had prevailed after the fall of the Almohads. Inland, the remains of Berber monarchies and Arab chieftains fragmented further. Each ruler attempted to rally opposition, but divided loyalties and limited technology left them at a disadvantage against Spanish guns and stone citadels. Tlemcen, once a lively capital of trade and scholarship, suffered particularly from this shift. Cut off from the coast, its economy faltered. Caravans arriving from the desert found fewer buyers, and wealth that had once flowed through inland markets now detoured towards Spanish-controlled ports. Paying tribute became the only alternative to destruction, while others turned to alliance with corsairs, seafaring rebels whose ships began to appear in growing numbers along the Algerian shore. At the same time, waves of Muslim refugees reached Algeria from across the sea. These were the Andalusian exiles, families exiled from Spain after the Reconquista and subsequent religious persecutions. Bringing with them highly developed crafts, building techniques, and knowledge of navigation, they reshaped the society that received them. Coastal towns expanded with whitewashed houses and new mosques reflecting Iberian design, while artisans introduced refined metalwork and textile weaving unfamiliar to local guilds. Their arrival infused North African urban life with skills that would later prove crucial in resisting European domination. Spain's occupation, however, strained resources and provoked near-constant warfare. Fortresses required constant supply lines across a treacherous sea, and each outpost sat amid populations hostile to foreign rule. Raids on Spanish positions became routine as inland leaders combined with seafaring communities to strike back. The growing resistance soon attracted attention from across the eastern Mediterranean, where the Ottoman fleet was expanding westward. By 1518, Ottoman privateers operating under imperial auspices entered North African politics, aligning themselves with local factions to challenge Spain directly. The collapse of the Maghreb's independent kingdoms followed swiftly. Their decline marked the passing of centuries of Berber autonomy and the beginning of a new imperial rivalry between Europe and the Ottoman world. Even the architecture of the era bore traces of the conflict. In several fortified coastal cities, captured Spanish cannons were melted down or embedded into the very walls they once threatened, turning instruments of conquest into part of Algeria's evolving urban landscape. Out of the disarray that followed the Spanish advance along North Africa's coast, two brothers from the Aegean emerged as unlikely saviors. Aroush and Khair al-Din Barbarossa, experienced corsairs who had long fought Christian powers in the Mediterranean, arrived in Algiers around 1516. Their ships carried cannons and seasoned fighters, offering protection to a city besieged by Spanish forts. In exchange, they sought allegiance with the Ottoman Sultan. When Aroush was killed in battle, his brother continued the struggle, and by 1518 formally placed Algiers under the protection of Istanbul. It marked the beginning of the Ottoman Regency of Algiers, an alliance that combined imperial authority with local autonomy and maritime power with tribal resilience. Though nominally governed in the Sultan's name, authority soon rested in the hands of a local ruler called the Dey. The Deys, chosen by the Janissary Corps stationed in Algiers, operated with almost complete independence from Constantinople. This system produced a unique political structure, Ottoman titles, institutions, and legal language blended with Berber customs and regional alliances. Administration focused mainly on the cities and coast, while the mountains and interior were managed indirectly through tribal leaders. Taxes and tributes kept the balance. It was a state both centralized and fragile, reliant on negotiation as much as coercion. As the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, Algiers evolved into a strong maritime republic dominated by corsairs. Its harbor was crowded with fast ships, many built or repaired by Andalusian craftsmen who had fled Spain after the fall of Granada. These vessels were run by mixed crews: Turks, Arabs, Berbers, converted Europeans, and even renegades who had turned from captives into commanders. They targeted merchant fleets from France, Spain, and Italy, capturing vessels, extracting ransoms, and turning piracy into a regulated business. The wealth generated from these expeditions financed palaces, mosques, baths, and public fountains that reshaped the city's skyline. Algiers became one of the finest ports in the Mediterranean, known as much for commerce as for captivity. The Janissaries formed the backbone of political life. Originally elite infantry imported from Ottoman lands, they grew into a self-contained military aristocracy that determined the fate of the Deys. When unpopular, a Dey might be deposed or quietly assassinated in the barracks that lined the Kasbah. This volatile circle of power gave the Regency both flexibility and unpredictability. Yet despite coups and rivalries, the system persisted for over 3 centuries, allowing Algiers to maintain its autonomy while other North African states fell under European domination. Beyond the capital, the countryside followed a different rhythm. Tribal confederations governed grazing lands, maintained local militias, and negotiated with Ottoman officials over taxation. Some recognized the Dey's authority only in name, while others maintained their independence through payments or alliances. The result was a mosaic of governance: imperial administration in the cities, customary law in the rural hinterlands, and long-distance trade crossing the Sahara. European powers tried repeatedly to crush the Regency's maritime independence. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, fleets from Britain, the Netherlands, France, and Spain bombarded Algiers. The city's fortifications survived, repaired each time by local stonemasons using heavy cannon barrels as reinforcement. This resilience earned it a lasting reputation across North Africa as the Fortress of the Maghreb. Even defeated, Algiers never submitted outright, defying European powers through diplomacy and rebuilt walls. A curious social transformation emerged from these centuries of conflict. Many European captives, especially sailors and craftsmen, lived long enough in Algiers to integrate into its society. They converted to Islam, married locally, and joined the corsair fleets that had once enslaved them. By the late 1700s, some of their descendants served in the very bureaucracy that managed ransoms and trade treaties, a reminder that the Ottoman Regency, forged in resistance and maritime power, thrived as a crossroads where empire, faith, and fortune collided. By 1830, the Ottoman Regency of Algiers had survived centuries of bombardment and rebellion, but internal corruption and weakened authority left it vulnerable. France, facing domestic unrest and financial pressures, saw an opportunity overseas. The spark came from an unlikely source: a diplomatic quarrel between the Dey of Algiers and the French consul. During a dispute over unpaid debts from grain supplies sent decades earlier, the Dey allegedly struck the consul with a fly whisk. In Paris, this small act became a political gift. Newspapers turned it into an insult to national honor, and the government, seeking distraction from internal troubles, seized on it as a pretext for military intervention. Soon, an armada of warships set sail from Toulon, bound for the Algerian coast. In June 1830, French troops numbering more than 30,000 landed near Sidi Farouk, west of Algiers. The Ottoman defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, relying on outdated artillery and hastily assembled local forces. After 3 weeks of fighting, French cannons breached the city's defenses. The Dey surrendered under promises that property, religion, and local customs would be respected. Those assurances were forgotten almost immediately. The city was looted, mosques were seized for military use, and centuries of Ottoman administration ended in a matter of days. What France had described as a limited punitive expedition quickly turned into a plan for permanent occupation. Initially, Paris viewed Algiers as a coastal outpost rather than an expansive colony. But once the army realized the fertility of the surrounding plains and the potential for settlement, the campaign moved inland. Military columns pushed toward the interior, dismantling local authority structures and seizing land for European farmers. The French government declared that Algeria was no longer Ottoman territory. It was to be France's extension across the Mediterranean. That shift transformed the war into a conquest of people as well as territory, setting the stage for one of the most persistent resistance movements of the 19th century. Among those who rose to resist was Emir Abd el-Kader, a young Sufi scholar from Western Algeria whose reputation for discipline and spirituality gave him legitimacy among diverse tribes. Elected leader in 1832, he created a network of loyal clans and established a functioning state centered on Islamic law and efficient administration. His capital moved frequently, following the army's needs, making his government both mobile and adaptable. He minted coins, negotiated treaties, and trained cavalry that could vanish into the mountains as quickly as they appeared on the plains. This organization turned fragmented resistance into a coordinated struggle with defined borders, taxes, and alliances. French generals found themselves fighting not just guerrilla bands, but a structured and ideological movement. Frustrated by Abd el-Qadir's agility, they resorted to collective punishment. Entire villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations deported to coastal camps. In some cases, troops sealed caves where people had sought shelter, suffocating everyone inside. These actions depopulated vast regions but failed to break the resistance. Abd el-Qadir continued to wage war through 1847, relying on both faith and diplomacy. After a final campaign left his forces isolated, he laid down arms under guarantees of safe exile. His surrender did not end his influence. While imprisoned and later exiled, Abd el-Qadir gained international respect for his restraint and ethical conduct in warfare. Years later, during his stay in Damascus in 1860, he protected thousands of Christians from sectarian violence, maintaining order when the Ottoman authorities could not. European newspapers that once branded him a rebel now praised him as a model of courage and humanity, the same qualities that had defined Algeria's first great struggle against foreign conquest. When France completed its conquest of Algeria, the colony's status remained uncertain for nearly 2 decades. That changed in 1848, when the French government declared that Algeria would no longer be treated as occupied territory, but as an integral part of France itself. Rather than a colony, it was divided into 3 civil departments: Algiers, Oran, and Constantine, and represented administratively as an extension of the mainland. This declaration suggested equality within the French Republic, yet the legal reality denied it. Indigenous Algerians were governed by the Indigenous Code, a separate set of rules that restricted travel, property ownership, and political participation. French settlers, meanwhile, enjoyed the full rights of citizens, creating 2 legal systems existing side by side under one flag. The colonial project relied heavily on land seizure. Fertile plains and coastal valleys were expropriated from local communities and redistributed to European farmers, known as colons or pieds noirs. What had been communal or tribal land became private estates, protected by French law and military power. Millions of Algerians were displaced into rocky highlands and arid zones, forced to work as tenant laborers or sharecroppers on the land they once owned. The result was an agricultural economy designed not for subsistence, but for export. Grain, olives, and wine flowed north to supply the French market, while rural Algeria bore the weight of poverty and dispossession. Infrastructure projects reinforced that relationship. Railways, ports, and paved roads connected the hinterland to coastal cities, all oriented toward metropolitan trade. Telegraph, postal network, and new administrative centers bound Algeria's economy and bureaucracy to Paris. These transformations impressed visiting Europeans as signs of progress, but for most Algerians, they represented forced adaptation. Traditional markets declined, caravan routes collapsed, and dependence on imported goods deepened. The colony was modernizing, but under foreign direction and for foreign profit. Urban life changed in visible ways. European settlers reshaped Algiers, Oran, and Constantine into replicas of southern French towns, complete with wide boulevards, public gardens, and stone government buildings. Within walking distance of these new quarters stood the old Medinas, the Kasbahs, densely packed, neglected, and increasingly impoverished. Muslim families crowded into decaying houses, while nearby cafes, hotels, and theaters served the colonial elite. Even religious structures were repurposed. Mosques became barracks, churches appeared in once exclusively Muslim neighborhoods, and Arabic schools were replaced by French lycées. A small number of Algerians sought advancement through education. The colonial system opened limited access to French language schools, producing a new class of interpreters, clerks, and professionals who straddled two worlds. Many admired European learning, yet chafed under the denial of equal rights. This educated minority later became the foundation for reform movements and early nationalist thought. Meanwhile, immigration from the Mediterranean basin diversified the colony's demographics. Spaniards, Italians, and Maltese joined the French settlers, adding to the European population that grew rapidly through the late 19th century. Despite their differences, they shared economic privileges unavailable to the Muslim majority, a structure that made inequality feel permanent. Resistance never disappeared. The largest uprising of the century, the Mokrani Revolt of 1871, mobilizing tens of thousands of Algerians from Kabylia and beyond. French troops overwhelmed the revolt, executing or deporting its leaders and confiscating still more land for settlers. The suppression reaffirmed who held power and deepened resentment across rural Algeria. By the early 1900s, the colony had become one of the world's major wine producers. Vast vineyards stretched across land once used for grazing or grain, supplying European markets with millions of liters annually. It stood as an unusual contradiction, a Muslim-majority country producing alcohol for foreign consumption. Beneath the apparent prosperity lay a society polarized by law, culture, and opportunity, a division that would define Algeria for generations to come. When World War II ended, thousands of Algerians returned home wearing French uniforms, convinced that their service would finally earn them political equality. They had fought in major European campaigns, endured heavy losses, and believed they had earned recognition. But post-war France treated Algeria not as a partner, but as a possession. Promises of reform gave way to censorship, economic hardship, and the same discriminatory laws that had defined colonial rule for nearly a century. The sense of betrayal spread quickly across towns, villages, and army barracks. That tension reached a deadly turning point on May 8, 1945, the day Europe celebrated Germany's surrender. In Sétif, a peaceful demonstration demanding equality and independence marched through the streets carrying both French and Algerian flags. When police opened fire on the crowd after a scuffle, chaos followed. Across Sétif, Guelma, and Karata, protests turned into violence, and the French response was overwhelming. Military units, settler militias, and aircraft launched reprisals that continued for weeks. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and thousands killed. The exact number of victims remains debated, but the trauma was unmistakable. The massacres shattered any remaining belief that France would willingly reform its colonial rule. In the years that followed, political activism spread into every layer of Algerian society. Veterans organized associations to demand rights, teachers formed study circles to promote literacy in Arabic, and migrants working in France began funding nationalist newspapers. The reformist parties that had petitioned for equality under French law lost credibility, giving rise to new movements that demanded full independence. For a younger generation, Sétif had proven that peaceful methods were futile. The path ahead would have to be fought, not negotiated. During the late 1940s, nationalist politics fragmented into competing visions. The most prominent legal organization, the Movement for the Triumph of Democratic Liberties, or MTLD, sought political representation through elections, arguing that gradual reform could still succeed. Its more militant members disagreed. They formed the Special Organization, a secret paramilitary network preparing for armed resistance. It recruited from students, workers, and veterans familiar with modern warfare. Weapons were hidden in desert farms or smuggled across borders from Tunisia and Morocco. Each regional branch operated independently to avoid discovery. Urban centers became focal points for coordination. Algiers and Iran saw the rise of underground cells that distributed pamphlets, collected funds, and managed covert communication between activists. Algerians living in France also played a major role. Industrial workers in Marseille and Lyon helped print and circulate banned materials, channeling money and information back to the homeland. Labor unions, student groups, and cultural associations turned exile into political refuge. These transnational ties linked the struggle in Algeria to broader anti-colonial sentiments growing across the post-war world. The French authorities responded with repression. Censorship tightened, newspapers were banned, and nationalist leaders arrested or exiled. Secret police monitored mosques, schools, and cafes for dissent. Yet these measures only strengthened underground networks. The state's refusal to recognize even moderate claims pushed rival movements closer together, fostering cooperation among Islamists, socialists, and nationalists alike. Each shared one goal: ending French rule. Within workshops, farmhouses, and student dorms, mimeograph machines quietly printed new publications. Ink stains and hand-cranked rollers replaced printing presses closed by censors. Smuggled stencils hidden inside suitcases crossed the Mediterranean to feed the presses. Entire resistance newspapers were produced in basements and back rooms, passed hand to hand under dim light. Their pages carried essays on identity, calls for self-determination, and coded instructions broadcast through poetry and allegory. These small circles of printers and distributors built the foundation of the nationalist underground that would soon emerge into open revolt. By the early 1950s, Algeria had become a nation divided not by ideology, but by method. Dialogue with France had failed, repression hardened resolve, and the clandestine movements born after Sétif prepared to act. The countdown to revolution had begun. On November 1st, 1954, a series of carefully planned attacks struck police posts, military depots, and communication lines across Algeria. The operations were carried out by a group calling itself the National Liberation Front, or FLN. Their goal was simple but immense: to end French rule through a coordinated national uprising. The event became known as the Toussaint Rouge, Red All Saints' Day, and marked the beginning of an 8-year struggle that would reshape both Algeria and France. The FLN sought to build a single front uniting farmers, workers, students, and nationalist groups under one banner. Its fighters worked from the mountains of the Aurais, the deserts of the south, and the narrow alleys of the coastal cities. Guerrilla warfare became their strategy, relying on small, mobile units that could strike quickly and disappear before the army could respond. France, determined to maintain what it still called its departments in North Africa, reacted with overwhelming force. Within months, tens of thousands of troops were sent to the colony. By the late 1950s, that number surpassed 400,000. Military command established fortified zones, aerial surveillance, and new counterinsurgency units trained specifically for colonial warfare. Interrogation, curfews, and collective punishment became routine. What began as a local revolt evolved into a modern war fought on every front, military, political, and psychological. In the countryside, villages suspected of aiding the FLN faced devastating reprisals. Entire communities were evacuated and relocated into controlled settlements called regroupment camps. Over 2 million civilians were moved during these operations, losing access to farmland and ancestral homes. The policy aimed to cut the insurgents off from their social base, but instead deepened rural resentment. As hardships spread, young men from displaced families joined the Maquis, the rural guerrilla units that grew stronger after each round of repression. Meanwhile, the war moved into urban centers. Algiers, the colonial capital, became a focal point of the conflict. The FLN established an underground network to coordinate bombings, strikes, and propaganda. French paratroopers answered with a campaign of mass arrests and torture meant to dismantle the organization. The confrontation reached its height in 1957, during the Battle of Algiers. Entire quarters of the Kasbah were sealed off, suspected militants rounded up, and intelligence gathered through brutal means. The French won short-term control of the city, but lost moral authority. The use of torture leaked to the public, dividing opinion in France and sparking outrage abroad. Despite strict censorship, news of the war's brutality spread through international media. Newly independent Arab and African nations offered political and financial support to the FLN, while non-aligned countries brought the issue before the United Nations. Algeria's conflict began to symbolize the wider decolonization struggle of the mid-20th century. Inside France, young intellectuals and veterans questioned the government's methods and the human cost of maintaining the empire. Within the FLN itself, rival leaders debated strategy and governance, but their shared objective kept the movement alive. By the early 1960s, French public opinion had shifted. Economic strain, political crises, and the fall of the Fourth Republic signaled that the war could not be sustained. Negotiations opened in the Swiss town of Evian. In March 1962, the Evian Accords ended hostilities and recognized Algeria's independence after 132 years of foreign domination. The aftermath was chaotic. Nearly 1 million Europeans, the Pied Noir, fled to France, and tens of thousands of Muslim auxiliaries known as Harkis followed, fearing reprisals. Amid the exodus, Algerian fighters celebrated victory. In the remote mountain camps where the war had begun, radio operators powered crude transmitters with car batteries to send coded messages announcing the end of colonial rule. Their signals, faint but steady, reached all the way to Cairo. When Algeria gained its independence in 1962, people poured into the streets to celebrate a victory that had taken nearly a decade of warfare and generations of resistance. Flags waved above ruined buildings, and refugees who had fled the fighting began to make their way back. Yet beneath the public excitement lay a nation struggling to define itself. The country's infrastructure was shattered, the economy unbalanced, and much of the skilled population had left. More than 800,000 European settlers had departed during the exodus following the ceasefire, leaving factories idle, farms unattended, and administrative offices empty. Algeria was free, but the machinery of a functioning state had to be built from almost nothing. The National Liberation Front, or FLN, which had led the War of Independence, became the cornerstone of political life. Having guided the military and diplomatic campaign that achieved sovereignty, it turned into a ruling party tasked with creating institutions for governance. Debates quickly emerged within its ranks over what type of nation should follow colonial rule. Some veterans favored a centralized system based on socialism and state planning, while others preferred looser control that allowed local autonomy. The army, whose organization had made the revolution possible, also expected a role in the decision-making. A fragile balance developed between civilian leaders, the military, and the regional structures that had governed liberated areas during the war. Ahmed Ben Bella stood at the center of this early transformation. A charismatic veteran of the independence movement, he returned from exile to wide acclaim. Appointed prime minister in 1962 and elected president the following year, he embodied the hope of a new beginning. Under his leadership, the government nationalized industries and farmland left behind by Europeans. These properties became state assets managed cooperatively by workers and peasants. The goal was not only economic recovery, but also social reform, reallocating wealth and opportunity to those excluded under colonial rule. Urban life slowly resumed as the state reopened schools, clinics, and ports. One of the government's first priorities was literacy. Decades of colonial policy had left millions of Algerians unable to read or write, particularly in Arabic. The administration launched vast education campaigns, sending volunteer teachers into remote villages and using classrooms as centers for rebuilding civic identity. Lessons included language, basic numeracy, and national history. Schools emphasized that Algeria's future depended on its citizens' ability to manage their own affairs and preserve their heritage. The new leadership also turned outward. Algeria joined the non-aligned movement, aligning itself with countries emerging from colonialism rather than with either Cold War bloc. Diplomats framed the country as a champion of anti-imperialist solidarity, offering support to liberation movements in Africa and Asia. Delegations from Ghana, Cuba, Egypt, and Yugoslavia visited Algiers, treating it as a gathering point for the developing world. The young republic's foreign policy projected confidence even as domestic institutions remained unsteady. Still, profound challenges persisted. Rebuilding roads, communication lines, and irrigation networks required both funding and technical expertise. Inflation rose, unemployment remained high, and regional leaders argued over who would control the new state's direction. Despite these difficulties, early post-independence Algeria reflected a powerful sense of purpose. Cultural centers and youth organizations spread across towns and villages, blending civic instruction with celebration of the revolution's ideals. Early postage stamps, school posters, and public murals carried simple illustrations explaining the national flag and its crescent, the martyrs of the war, and the values of unity and work. In a society rebuilding from ashes, even such small images functioned as civics lessons, guiding citizens toward a shared understanding of what independence was meant to achieve. In June 1965, Algeria's young republic experienced its first major power shift since independence. Defense Minister Houari Boumédiène, supported by the army, removed President Ahmed Ben Bella from office in a bloodless coup. The action was presented as a correction rather than a revolution. Boumédiène promised stability after years of political infighting and administrative confusion. Many Algerians accepted the change quietly, wary of economic hardship and leadership disputes. The military presence and daily governance solidified quickly, creating a new political order centered on discipline, efficiency, and national unity rather than individual charisma. Boumédiène built a highly centralized system where decision-making flowed from the presidency downward through state agencies and the single ruling party. The army became an invisible but constant source of authority, ensuring that opposition movements remained small and scattered. While the regime limited public debate, it invested in long-term economic planning. A succession of national development programs defined the late 1960s, each focused on industrial growth and education. The government viewed modernization as the path to independence in practice, not just in name. Algeria's planners tried to turn the vast resources of the Sahara into the foundation of a self-sufficient economy. Early progress came from state investment in energy infrastructure. Boumédiène and his advisors argued that control of natural resources was the true measure of post-colonial sovereignty. Foreign companies had long extracted oil and gas from Algerian territory under contracts signed before independence. In 1971, the government took full control of these industries through nationalization. It was a decisive act that dramatically increased state revenue and transformed Algeria's role in global energy markets. Firms from Europe and the United States negotiated new arrangements under Algerian terms. The policy demonstrated that the country, though recently independent, could exercise the same economic authority as older nations. The influx of oil income allowed major public projects to advance rapidly. Steel complexes rose in Annaba, new industrial towns appeared on the steppe, and universities expanded to train engineers and scientists. Each plan carried the same message: modernization would serve national dignity. Construction sites multiplied across the country, roads into the Sahara, housing developments for factory workers, and large irrigation dams designed to expand farmland. Agrarian reform complemented these efforts, redistributing property to cooperatives and promoting mechanized agriculture. Success varied across regions. Poor soil and limited transport slowed progress in many rural areas, but the policy marked a deliberate attempt to link economic equality with modernization. Algeria's growing wealth and political confidence lifted its international profile. Boumédiène positioned the country as an active voice within the non-aligned movement, a coalition rejecting both Cold War superpowers. From international meetings in Belgrade to summits in Africa and Asia, Algerian diplomats promoted solidarity among newly independent nations. The government supported liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Palestine, presenting this aid as repayment of the help once offered to Algerian revolutionaries. Such policies gave Algeria influence far beyond its borders, and Algeria became a destination for activists and exiles seeking an example of post-colonial leadership. Domestically, strict political control persisted alongside these achievements. Independent unions and newspapers faced closures, and political dissent remained tightly monitored. Yet many citizens accepted the restrictions in exchange for stability, employment, and national pride. State media emphasized themes of unity and progress, portraying the country's modernization as a collective effort rather than a partisan agenda. The results were visible even from above. The newly expanded Hassi Messaoud oil fields illuminated the desert at night, their flares and pipelines forming bright lines across the sands, a visible sign of Algeria's assertion of control over its own resources. When Houari Boumédiène died in 1978, Algeria faced a quiet uncertainty. His long rule had emphasized stability through centralized authority, but it had also left little room for public participation. The army and the ruling FLN now turned to Chadli Benjedid, a career officer with a cautious manner and a modest approach to leadership. Benjedid inherited a state with growing social pressures hidden beneath the surface of its apparent discipline. His presidency opened a new chapter centered on controlled reform, an attempt to relax political rigidity while preserving the system's core. During the early years of his tenure, Benjedid moved to reduce the dominance of state planning that had defined the Boumédiène era. Economic liberalization began gradually, The government encouraged small private enterprises and eased restrictions on foreign investment, hoping to revive stagnant industries. While heavy industry had expanded under Boumédiène, much of it operated inefficiently, producing low returns and limited jobs. The administration shifted attention toward consumer goods and agriculture, aiming to satisfy growing public demand. A new set of investment laws allowed joint ventures with foreign partners, marking one of the first genuine experiments with a mixed economy since independence. The policy changes coincided with turbulence in the global oil market. Falling petroleum prices through the 1980s struck Algeria's finances directly, as oil and gas had become the backbone of state revenue. Public spending contracted, and previously generous social programs tightened. Unemployment rose sharply, particularly among youth entering cities in search of work. At the same time, rapid population growth outpaced housing and infrastructure development. Inflation eroded wages, and basic goods grew scarce in several provinces. For a generation born after independence, the economic slowdown felt like a broken promise of progress. Discontent first appeared in the form of small strikes and student protests. By mid-decade, social tensions spread widely. Many Algerians complained that the FLN, the only legal political organization, had become detached from everyday life. Local bureaucracies were viewed as inefficient, and the privileges of senior officials provoked public anger. The widening gap between a restless urban youth and a rigid political structure created pressure that no administrative reform could contain. This tension erupted in October 1988, when demonstrations began over food prices but quickly turned into nationwide protests demanding political change. The scale of unrest surprised the leadership. When crowds filled the streets of Algiers and other major cities, the army intervened. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing hundreds. The use of force shocked both citizens and officials, exposing the fragility of a system long portrayed as stable. For the first time since independence, the state's authority looked uncertain. The uprising forced Benjedid to attempt a major redefinition of power. In 1989, a new constitution was introduced that legalized multi-party politics, expanded press freedom, and reduced the FLN's monopoly. Newspapers independent of the state began to circulate, publishing criticism of policies that would once have been censored. Political associations quickly multiplied across the country, representing regional, ideological, and religious perspectives. Among them, the Islamic Salvation Front, or FIS, grew rapidly, drawing support from communities disillusioned with years of economic reform that favored few and left many behind. Cultural life changed alongside politics. The 1980s marked the arrival of satellite dishes, cassette recordings, and imported television programs that connected ordinary Algerians to the wider world. Homes in Algiers, Oran, and Constantine tuned in to global sports, movies, and new forms of music. These influences shaped urban youth culture, introducing styles and attitudes that blended foreign trends with local identity. What began as cautious reform under Benjedid ended as an awakening of diverse voices, voices that would soon challenge the country's political future. In 1991, Algeria prepared for its first multi-party elections, an event that seemed to open a new democratic chapter after decades of one-party rule. Dozens of political groups competed for seats, but attention quickly centered on the Islamic Salvation Front, or FIS, which combines social programs, religious messaging, and outspoken criticism of government corruption. When the first round of voting took place in December, the results left little doubt about its popularity. The FIS captured most major municipalities and appeared ready to secure a majority in the next round. For many Algerians, the vote reflected years of frustration with economic decline and political exclusion. For the military and the established elite, it looked like the potential loss of the state itself. Before the second round could occur, army leadership intervened. In January 1992, the election was canceled. President Benjedid was forced to resign, and a High Council of State assumed power. The annulment triggered mass protests, strikes, and a rapid descent into confrontation. Thousands of FIS members were arrested or sent to desert camps. The party was declared illegal, driving its supporters underground. Within months, parts of the opposition turned to armed struggle. Algeria found itself entering a civil conflict whose intensity and duration no one had anticipated. Armed groups began organizing in remote mountain areas, especially in the east and center of the country. These formations, initially claiming to defend democracy, soon fragmented into smaller units with differing agendas. The largest, the Armed Islamic Group, or GIA, targeted not only state forces but anyone they considered collaborators. Government troops responded with heavy operations, raids, and arrests. By the mid-1990s, both sides resorted to extreme violence. Villages were attacked at night, entire families massacred, and civilians abducted without trace. Fear defined daily life in both rural and urban areas. In the cities, curfews limited movement, and checkpoints divided neighborhoods. Bombings and assassinations became frequent, pushing many families to flee from one region to another in search of safety. The war's impact reached beyond the battlefield. Journalists, artists, and intellectuals faced constant threats as cultural expression turned into a risky act. Newspapers operated under danger, balancing between censorship and retaliation. Writers and teachers who promoted secular ideas were targeted, while others were kidnapped for ransom or ideological vengeance. Radio and television carried messages urging unity, yet even entertainment programs hinted at the strain of collective trauma. Schools shortened schedules for security reasons, and universities saw attendance drop as violence spread into urban centers. Fragmentation deepened as Islamist factions fought each other over leadership and ideology. Some rejected attacks on civilians, while others pursued terror as strategy. The state also developed local defense groups, arming villagers who knew the terrain. In some areas, these militias provided protection. In others, they added another layer of conflict. Ordinary Algerians lived between armies, each claiming loyalty to the nation or to faith. By the late 1990s, exhaustion set in. Estimates of death ranged in the tens of thousands, though exact numbers remained uncertain. Seeking an end to the bloodshed, newly elected President Abdelaziz Bouteflika introduced reconciliation measures beginning in 1999. The policy offered amnesty to militants who surrendered their weapons and reintegrated into society. Gradually, violence declined, roads reopened, and displaced families began returning. Algeria emerged from the decade deeply marked but intact. During those years, communication itself became a tool of conflict. Without reliable newspapers or free broadcasting, cassette tapes circulated hand to hand. Sermons, speeches, and coded messages traveled through markets and taxis, carrying propaganda or appeals for peace. These small plastic reels replaced newspapers as the main channel of persuasion, turning sound into a battlefield of its own. In early 2019, Algeria entered one of the most unexpected and transformative moments of its modern history. Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who had ruled since 1999, announced his intention to seek a fifth presidential term. By then, he had rarely appeared in public for years, His health visibly deteriorated after a stroke in 2013. For many Algerians, his candidacy symbolized not just his clinging to power, but the stagnation of an entire political system. Institutions appeared paralyzed, while unemployment and corruption eroded public trust. When his announcement was broadcast, it ignited outrage, an emotion quietly building since the end of the Civil War decades earlier. Within weeks, people organized through social media and local networks rather than political parties. The first demonstrations began modestly, yet they quickly grew into nationwide marches. Young people, veterans, and families filled streets across Algiers, Oran, Constantine, and smaller towns that had rarely seen protest. This surge became known as the Hirak movement, meaning simply the movement. It was spontaneous, self-organized, and remarkably peaceful. Protesters gathered every Friday, turning a day of rest into a ritual of civic expression. Their main slogan, heard across boulevards and squares, was Yetnaha Ga, they all must go. The phrase captured a shared demand to remove not just one leader, but the entire entrenched elite linked to decades of clientelism and stagnation. What distinguished Hirak was not only its size, but its restraint. Demonstrations avoided violence, even under pressure from security forces. Protesters brought children, carried flags, and cleaned the streets after each march. The unity across languages and regions was unprecedented. Berber-speaking communities from the Kabylie region marched alongside Arabic-speaking groups from the south, creating a national front that emphasized inclusion rather than division. The tone was serious but often humorous. Handmade signs displayed sharp wit and creative wordplay in Arabic, Tamazight, and French. Some mocked official slogans, while others questioned the logic of a system that promised reform yet repeated the same patterns of control. By March and April, the momentum became impossible to ignore. Students walked out of universities, lawyers staged silent demonstrations, and the country's powerful labor unions began to voice sympathy with protesters. Faced with overwhelming pressure, Bouteflika resigned in April 2019, ending 20 years in office. His departure was a historic moment accomplished without armed conflict or civil breakdown. Yet, it did not resolve the underlying question of how Algeria would transition to a genuinely accountable government. Interim authorities scheduled new elections, promising gradual reform, but many citizens refused to participate, arguing that genuine change required dismantling old networks of power. The protests persisted, although their focus evolved, from removing one leader to reimagining the entire political order. Even after arrests of activists and restrictions on public gatherings, the ideals of Hirak survived in discussions at cafes, universities, and online forums. Digital platforms became central to this new civic life. Live streams broadcast marches in real time, independent journalists shared updates bypassing state media, and humor circulated through memes that criticized the political scene while uniting people across age and social background. As the pandemic began in 2020, the rhythm of public demonstrations slowed, but the sense of collective awakening remained intact. Despite economic hardship, falling oil revenues, and political fatigue, the movement's legacy endures. It opened space for public accountability unseen in decades and reintroduced a spirit of open discussion about Algeria's direction. The protest's creativity produced a distinct form of cultural expression: murals, poetry, and banners that turned entire streets into living galleries of civic art. These messages, often written in 3 languages, expressed skepticism, pride, and humor, capturing the renewed energy of a society confronting its past while defining its future. Massinissa's alliance with Rome brought order, but at the cost of independence, a choice Algeria would echo for centuries. Through empires and revolutions, one truth remained: freedom is never given, only reclaimed. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe and turn on the bell. More stories from the past are still to come.